our first panel, if I could get my panelists to join me up on stage, we're going to be talking about how to innovate in a time of transformation. And doing that with me today is Josh Gould, Manager of Utility of the Future at Con Ed, and Jason Scarlett, Director of Enterprise Innovation and Architecture at CPS Energy. If you two gentlemen could just have a seat right over there. So thank you for joining us today for our first fireside chat. We're going to be talking about innovation, which Chris mentioned. We're going to be talking about that throughout the day. But I wanted to start our conversation with culture because, we're going to hear from our finalists, and they're going to be talking about, specific solutions. But I think that culture does play a large role in innovation. The technology and processes can maybe be there, but is it going to live in the organization? Is it going to work out? So my first question for you gentlemen today is, how would you currently describe utility culture? How would you describe that?
All right, I'll go first. Thanks for that softball. So I think, much like the industry, we're in a time of transformation with our cultures. Historically, within a utility, you have lots of verticals, lots of silos. You'll hear in the past where, if there was a problem within that silo, it's expected that silo kind of would resolve that over some period of time. I think today, as the utility industry is changing, our workforce and our culture needs to change a little bit too. So it's no longer acceptable just to allow somebody to languish in a silo. It's actually expected, at least at CPS Energy, all of our senior chiefs, if there's a problem in, say, power gen this week, the CFO and the IT organization is expected to help out. I think that translates down to employees to be more collaborative and more sharing than we've seen in the past, because it used to be that utilities were long-term employment places where you have a whole career. You kind of work your way up the hierarchy over a period of time. I think that model has changed forever, and I think there's going to be much more zigzags and hopping to new areas, and part and parcel of that is to be able to collaborate with different people, with finance people, engineers, with customer service folks.
So my favorite comment about culture is someone once said to me that culture is like hugging a cloud. That it's a hard thing to define, it's a hard thing to get your arms around. But I think one of the key ways, so that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just like clouds exist, culture absolutely exists and it affects things. But it seems to me it's a little bit of a second order effect. And the culture that you describe, in my mind, is to some degree a natural outgrowth of what the incentives are at a utility. And how we measure things and all that. And this gets back to innovation. So this gets back to innovation, and if you think there is a very good reason and totally defensible reason for risk aversion at a utility, and I think how you get at the kind of cultural effect and how you start to change that is to have senior leadership, frankly, embrace bounded failure is sort of what I would call it. So let's play in our sandbox. Let's understand we're going to take some bets on some things and they don't work out. And then critically, it's like own the failures. Let's surface them. Like, people want to bury your dead very quietly. Like let's celebrate whatever didn't work and have that come from the top. So anyway, I think difficult thing to get your arms around, but there are real incentives at play, and I think to the degree that you can affect some of those incentives that lead to that risk aversion, that's how you start to change culture.
I think that's a key point. Really, I don't know can everybody hear me okay?
No.
No?
Take that.
Either one are working. Okay, so we'll pass this around. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think that you look at what traditionally utilities are measured by. It's performance-based. We have lots of metrics. How long are our customers out in an outage? We have KD, safety, all these different metrics that we're measuring against, and it's all around responding to failure. Failure's bad, and so when you bring these different cultures in, we got to say, okay, we can have a safe place to try some things and experiment,
and fail. And I think it goes against our operational thing. We have to keep the lights on. So I think that's where you see the impacts to culture.
I mean, Josh, you talked about risk aversion, and it's understandable as to why that is part of the culture, but innovation is slowly, pushing back on that or maybe changing that. Can you kind of talk about how innovation is, creeping up in utility culture? How are you seeing that play out?
Another typical utility thing is someone once told me, and I actually totally find this to be true too as well, that utilities want to be first to be second. So no one really wants to go first, but then when they see someone like take that dip into the water, then senior management at like EPRI or EEI events or whatever, they start talking. Wait, you all have a venture fund, and you're participating in this fund, or you're doing something like that. And so, frankly, I think that's one of the ways in which it starts. But I think the other way in which it starts, and this is something we've talked about as well, is the demographics at utilities are changing. And you can, at Con Edison here, so we're the electric, gas, and steam utility for Greater New York City, and you can sort of visually see that. And for us, there's a little bit of a barbell, and that there's particularly in senior management, there's like a big boomer generation, and then a lot of our frontline employees are, unfortunately for me, much younger than me, and so we're no longer even millennials. What is it, Z, right? Yeah. And so I think that has a lot of implications. People are more familiar and comfortable with things like social media, and I find we should be careful about making age-based stereotypes. But I will say that I think there are some real demographic differences and some differences in terms of comfortability with trying things, comfortability with failure, that those employees who have not been at Con Edison quite as long are bringing. So I think there's some like industry pressure and some industry culture, but I also think there's some very organic, bottoms up, kind of people-led innovation, just because they're not steeped in the ways of this is the way we always did it.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think I really like the different generational things. It brings a diversity of thought to your innovation programs. And just a quick example, this year we did something unique. Every year CPS Energy has an internship program, which I'm sure most of your companies have as well, where we bring in local high school students and college students. And this year they approached me and said, hey, could we do 30 minutes on innovation with these students? And I was like, how about 2 days? And one of the things that we did is we brought just to give you a perspective, we had 60 CPS Energy interns, high school and college, but we also invited some of our civic partners. So our partner Epicenter, thanks for being here, Jill, brought in some of their interns. We also had Holtcat, which is a major customer of CPS Energy, brought their interns in, and San Antonio Water System, our sister utility here in San Antonio. So we had about 130 high school and college students, but we paired them up with mentors, the baby boomers of the organization. They did a reverse pitch. They got up there and said, here's our problem, come work with me, and then we'll walk you through a pitch program. So after the end of day 2, the students got up and pitched. And I have to tell you, the quality of the ideas that are coming out of the Gen Z, millennial kind of area is amazing. They don't have the typical constraints. Oh, that won't work here. We tried that 20 years ago and it failed miserably, and the guy that ran it was run off from the company. Those types of, I'm over-exaggerating a little bit, but there is a really benefit to an organization to kind of leverage that generational diversity of thought that I think utilities really need to tap into.
You both just mentioned, so Josh, you mentioned, these new employees, this diversity of thought. Jason, you're kind of talking about the community, how the community is kind of influencing how you're approaching innovation, which leads to my question of who is really driving innovation within utilities? Is it the employees who have, their boots on the ground and they see a problem and they take it up? Is it top down? Is it coming from external forces? Who's really driving innovation?
the consulting answer is yes. It is all the above, and I think leveraging all the above from your employee programs. We have a very strong partnership again with EPRI and also Epicenter. Z-Prime with this event, so leveraging those commercial partners as well. We also, being a municipally owned utility, we do a lot of community innovation. So with the university students, we also partner with the city of San Antonio with a lot of their smart grids. We're the enabling kind of, infrastructure behind a lot of the smart city initiatives. So we've run idea-thons with the city and city residents asking for city challenges. We've actually engaged our customers as well. So we've had innovation challenges for customer ideas as well. We call that a customer-centric competition, or C3, and that was really kind of interesting. And actually, the winner of that competition has been in the Epicenter incubator, as she was just in an idea stage, and it's kind of been nice to see the growth of that. That's something that a utility wouldn't necessarily be able to do, because we need to keep a little bit of a arm's length of a potential RFP situation in the future. Ooh. Both mics working now. So leveraging the entire community, and then we're also expanding that concept into a regional, kind of concept. Why just CPS Energy? Why not Austin Energy, New Braunfels Utilities? We have this really interesting energy corridor in South Texas. Why don't we leverage that? We all share as utilities a lot of the same challenges and need some of the same types of solutions, so why not partner with that?
So one very important thing to add to that, while I completely agree, everyone to some degree, at least if you're going to be effective around innovation, is going to be responsible. But roles and responsibilities, like actually driving it forward day to day, those are really critical, and it's really critical to establish those up front, at least speaking within the bounds of a utility. So we actually have particular roles that are described by particular words. To give an example, for specific innovation activities where we're really making a bet on something and going deep, we have what's called an owner, and there's a very good reason that we have that name. That person is responsible and accountable, but they're also supported by the rest of the organization in driving whatever idea or project or process forward. And that idea of ownership is really critical, because if it's truly everyone's job, then oftentimes it can be no one's job. The other thing which is really critical, and I think this is important for particularly for the startup audience in here to hear, is one thing that's just almost consistently overlooked in terms of being able to innovate either with or at a utility is another word that we use is what's called enablers. So if you're a startup and you're like, why is it taking so long for this utility to get a contract or to start this pilot or whatever it is? It tends to be the same couple of things, which we call enablers. It's procurement or supply chain, it's law, and then sometimes it's IT and cyber. And so we have specific roles of someone in those departments who's accountable for innovation-like activities, because what you're doing typically at a utility is maybe you're buying a $300 million ERP system or something like that, and you want to procure the heck out of it. I would use another word, but you're going to stay PC, and you're going to write all sorts of terms and conditions from a legal standpoint. If I'm doing a $300K pilot, don't use the same tool for that pilot. Otherwise, it's going to take a year to get the pilot off the ground, right? And that's something that's it's not very sexy to talk about, and it's not what I think a startup thinks about when they're how can I, really drive action at a utility? But those enablers are so important. So yes, everyone is responsible, but making clear up front what are the roles and responsibilities and who's accountable for what is just really critical in terms of moving quickly.
You mentioned startups. We're here at our startup competition. My question for maybe the startups in the room, you guys could give them some insight, and what role do you even see the startup really playing when it comes to innovation within utilities?
So, really what we're trying to build, at least at CPS Energy, is an ecosystem of new ideas. We're in this transformation journey. Sometimes we feel like we're moving too fast, and the exact same minute after that, we feel like we're not moving fast enough. But one of the things that we find is critical is we need to have an ecosystem of people we can go to with our biggest problems. If we can procure our way out of it or just throw more resources and solve it, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for those really thorny problems that we cannot find a solution for. And we think building an ecosystem around that, although we may not be able to do something today, we think it's important to cultivate that, because when we're really stuck, we want to go to these really smart people that think out of the box and have different approaches to the legacy problems that we're trying to solve, to kind of help us when we're, if we do nothing and continue to do what we're doing, we're going to go extinct. So we need to be able to do that, but at the same time, we have to keep the lights on today. We have to provide safe, reliable services to our customers, but we also need to change the plane in mid-flight as well. And I think the startup community as well, I think as a utility person, we can do a lot better job of communicating what our specific challenges are. I think the other part of it that doesn't get touched a lot is providing data sets to kind of support those challenges. So these innovative companies can go out there and kind of iterate on some things and say, this is what we heard, we believe we have a solution, here's showing some representative data, maybe not your real data, we call it pseudo data, so it's structurally the same as our underlying data sources, but it's made up to protect customer privacy issues and a lot of the thorny issues that we have to do around data. But we think that's kind of fuel to kind of, for this innovation ecosystem and what the startup community often asks us for, data and, what our biggest problems are.
And just like any relationship, it's a two-way street. So a utility is responsible for a part of it, and a startup is responsible for a part of it. What I often see failure mode from startup is, you're a young company, you're very focused on, dealing with like an insanely long sales cycle to a utility and all the, it's maddening, I'm sure, trying to sell to a utility when you want to move fast as a startup. But that drive for revenue often means that you have a product and you take a very, very transactional approach sometimes, meaning I've got this product, and I want to sell it to you, and it's kind of a one-way direction. There has to be, and you talked about it, you have to start from a problem, and if you're not listening to or soliciting what the problem is, I don't think the transactional approach is going to work, because it's not clear that your solution is actually adequately addressing whatever whatever problem the utility has. So that's kind of, I think, to a large degree on the startup is, even before you transact, can you find a way to truly solicit what that problem is? And it's probably might even take some networking within a utility. It's going to take asking questions rather than just selling. So that's something that's also just a little bit different. But I think that's really critical. Now, conversely, on the utility side, I have found one of our key failure modes is a lack of problem definition. And that can be in a couple ways. One is you just aren't aligned internally on what the actual problem is. So different people have very different conceptions of what that problem is, and then maybe you're speaking with the startup, and the startup's like, well, I'm hearing A and I'm hearing B, and that doesn't make sense. And so there needs to be a little internal alignment and coming together around what the problem is. And then I also hear far too often problems described in overly simplistic ways. So for instance, like, well, you want to drive out O&M costs. Well, of course you do. Like every utility does, but you got to take it, a level deeper than that. Or we want to optimize our fleet. That's also not a bad. That's a better step of the way to solution. But have you done anything around fleet optimization yet? Can you describe specific problems? And the more specific you can get as a utility, the better position to startup is to solve it. So again, two-way street, common failure modes on each side, but I think both those things can be addressed.
You were just talking about this, Jason. Maybe you could get a little more of your thoughts on it. How can utilities do a better job of articulating their problems to the startups? I mean, if they don't know what they should be doing, then how can they provide value?
Okay, this is I have a dream moment. Sorry for indulging me here. I would like to be able to come up with that structured set, working through our strategies and see where we have those gaps that we can't solve, have a formalized part of that, and then have other utilities kind of contribute theirs as well. Look for commonality, because a lot of the startups may solve one problem that solves a problem at CPS Energy that's not a market for it at any other utility. So I would love to see folks like Z Prime, EPRI, those big entities that we all trust, in the organization, our incubator networks, to kind of consolidate what the industry's biggest challenges are and the commonality across multiple utilities. So if you solve one of these problems, you can sell it in these 20 utilities. And that feeds really well to the old way of the old culture of utilities, and I think you touched on it in the very first question. If Con Ed is doing it, I'm now interested in it. That was very much how a lot of things were purchased. That's why there's only really two CIS systems for utilities in the United States, because we all bought whatever the other utility bought. So I think I would love to see movement in that area. Hopefully by the time I retire from the utility, that'll be a reality, because I think it would be real helpful for both sides of the equation.
Yeah, just to reinforce, I think that is so if you look at a kind of values-based approach to innovation, I think everything we're talking about here today, and really this event, and to a large degree what Z Prime is doing, it's fundamentally about collaboration. That sounds really, nice and fuzzy and all that, but if you do it in the right way, if you do it in the rigorous way, you can really drive value around that. And I think we have a lot, that's something I'm also kind of optimistic about from a demographic standpoint. I frankly see some of the people who are newer in our organization both more interested in and frankly better at collaboration, and so I'm excited about what that can generate.
Let's get back to talking about the utility and kind of the utility employees and how innovation affects the organization from that standpoint. And I believe we have a short minute-long clip to show on this. My question is, before we see the clip, and then we'll address the question, is what can utilities do to support their employees in a way that ensures innovation is implemented to actually achieve the objectives it was set out to achieve? So can we see that video real quick, and then we'll have our Josh and Jason answer that question.
That this opportunity was available. I thought it was a really positive experience. I think it's great that this opportunity was available. I personally submitted but did not get picked, but it was cool that it seems like there's an opportunity to continue to develop with that, and also seeing a lot of my coworkers get selected on the short list and then also as finalists was also really cool.
It was great. It was nice. It was nice going through just our kind of our sales pitch, I guess.
I mean, you could see it in their face that they were enjoying it. Plus, I was also enjoying it, having people coming asking me about the project that we were involved in. So it's good to know that it wasn't just an idea that we had, but something that others kind of could see, envisioning, growing, and maybe, becoming part of the company.
So it's great that CPS is moving towards fostering innovation in-house and opening this new avenue for employees to
And
provide.
so then they start whispering, and then they get excited, and their voice gets louder, and then we get in trouble. So
It was awesome.
Just being able to share that with everybody, and everybody liked it. It wasn't people were, you could hear them talking about, did you go see that booth? Did you go see this booth? So as I heard people asking,
opportunity to have a different level of connectivity with the company that I didn't have before. I would have never come into this shop in the company, in this individual's world, and see what is the interconnectivity to the things that I do. And so I had a couple of examples that they would come and tell me, everything that they do in the area. How can I and my team support that department in this area, since we have already gone this far, maturing our data analytics?
Everyone I spoke to had a very positive experience around the competition, and thought it was a good course of action for CPS as a company.
So Jason, can you kind of explain a little bit
Yeah.
what we just watched?
So, pardon for the, corporate communications did not create that video. It's something that we created. So, that was shot on an iPhone. My buddy Arun did that because mainly we were meeting with people. And one of the things that we did when you do an employee innovation challenge, especially when you did the first one, you think about the people that don't win. And some of these interviews started to come through, the people we offered to kind of give them feedback about their ideas and, give them, for suggestions. So they'll be more encouraged to submit. If that first experience goes bad, they're not going to come back. One of the things that, as we going through that process, we were just hearing these amazing stories about how, even though they lost, how it impacted their lives and how they saw that as a change within, in really getting their voice heard within CPS Energy. And at a certain point, I turned to Arun and I was like, nobody's going to believe these stories that we're telling because they're just incredibly emotional stories. The highlight of my career is talking to some of these people that didn't win. So we started to say, hey, we need to videotape this. And that was kind of a result of that. Arun kind of blended that all together and stuff like that. So we kind of showed some of the emotion and what impact these employee programs have internally. A few things that we learned about doing that first innovation, we've already done two on that, we're getting ready for the third, is our employees aren't equipped well with presenting their ideas. So when we met with them and talked to them verbally, they did an excellent job. But communicating through a written form, blind kind of process, it didn't always come out. So one of the things we said is we need to get our employees to think like startups and how accelerators and incubators kind of work with startups on their pitch deck to refine their message so it gets their idea put forward. So in this year's process, we asked Epicenter to come in. We brought 20 of the finalists into a workshop. They did 4 weeks with Andy Littlejohn, which is downstairs running the Clean Tech Open event right now. So we'll see her later on. And they really kind of went through the whole process of the startup. Who's your customer? What are their pain points? So what? Why you? Kind of questions. And then we provided an opportunity to have an innovation fair where you heard some of those things spoken about there. The key to them was having the employees kind of come to each booth and have them kind of pitch to each employees. And, that was a lot of excitement. This year we also added the ability to see all the ideas. Before it was like you submitted to a blind box, there was this unnamed team of 20 people that evaluated, and then we put them all in front of the chiefs. This time we opened that up to all the employees. The employees upvoted that thing. They also provided comments to try to make the idea better. We really kind of democratized the whole process around that. So that was one of the key things. And we're learning each time. Next time we'll learn that, sometimes the disadvantage of that is it becomes a popularity competition, and the people that present later in the list, they're not in the top 10, so they never get seen. So we're adding some changes for next year to have a pairwise evaluation, so you're comparing two ideas, so we have a little bit more statistics around it and everybody gets a fair shake. But then we're going to add kind of an expert level review in the final stages to make sure that we're really getting innovations and we're dealing with process improvement in a different way, and then we're doing ideas that are more employer engagement ideas in a different way through people and culture programs. So I think that was one of the big successes is teaching our employees to do it. And it's something that we feel it's going to pay back over time. Those people went back into with these tool sets, and then next year we'll bring in another 20. And then over time we'll have these ambassadors embedded into each business unit and can take some of those, okay, this is how you present an idea in the organization.
Just one very brief thing to add is I think one of the principles you've illustrated there, Jason, is, and one of the real values that innovation can bring to a utility internally is empowering and listening to folks on the front line. And what you find is when you start asking for ideas and then you demonstrate to people that you're actually listening, whether they were selected or not, whether your idea gets funded or not, whatever, there's a really great cultural impact that can happen there. And it's also based, on a pretty basic principle that if someone is relatively close to a problem, they're likely closer to the solution. So myself as an innovation professional, I'm fond of saying I don't really have any original ideas, which is not not any sort of form of false humility. It just reflects the fact that I'm not as close to, say, a day-to-day operational safety problem is as one of our frontline employees. So the extent to which we can empower and enable employees who are close to those problems and therefore also close to those solutions, that can have a really great cultural impact as well.
Yeah, good. An add-on to that, so actually the winner of this year's employee competitions was a group of call center people. I mean, these are the front line of the front line. And they came up with a chatbot idea, and who better knows what can be automated and put in a chatbot than the people that answer the calls every day. And there was an IT group that had a similar idea, but they didn't have that. So they didn't win, but the chatbot did. What we tried to facilitate, and that's a lot of what I think the group that I'm involved in, is really making these matches. Maybe it's a startup activity. Maybe it's just getting two departments to work together. We really, encouraged them to say, hey, you guys won, but there was this other idea that got a lot of votes out of the IT organization. Partner together and then pitch to the chiefs with a combined thing. So we had the technologists and the frontline employees, and I think it made it a stronger pitch when they eventually pitched to the CEO their idea. So that was kind of interesting that the right people are getting involved.
Both of you kind of touched on it a little bit when I was asking you about the startups. Dylan and I have been working recently on part of our podcast series where we're actually interviewing a lot of founders of startups, and we heard some really great advice from one of the women who had started a company, and she said, you have to be open to constructive criticism. Be confident, but be open to constructive criticism. So my question is, what is your advice for the startups in the room as, they're trying to figure out how to help you solve their problems in valuable ways?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is, be mindful of, we have lots of vendors that come to a utility every day, and we have to be a little selective of that. If you can work with an incubator startup that has a relationship with the utility, we're more apt to work with that because they're, at least if they're doing their job, which they are, they're kind of telling you what the problem is. Here's the key issue for this executive. This executive cares about this. A lot of times you get one shot at the executive team. If you're not going to put your best foot forward, that might be it for you at that utility. So leverage some of these facilitated relationships that have these contacts within the utility, and I think that would improve the success rate. They'll do the matching of that utility has this types of problems, your solution addresses this one, so you're not focusing on features and functions that aren't relevant to the problems that our executives are feeding. So if you can find a situation for that for wherever region you are, a lot of these incubators, accelerators are working on being more virtual, so it doesn't matter necessarily where in the world that you work on that. I think that would be a big part of it. Attend our events, these types of events. We hold things like City of the Future with Z Prime coming up in January or February, I believe? February. So that's where you're going to be able to see and hear from our executives that intelligence, and some of these are streamed online, so it's not going to be a big expense for you. So really try to learn and target your message to the problems of the utility, and the more you can do that and get off on that right foot the first time, I think it'd be successful. And then once you have a story, make sure that all the other utilities know that you're working for that utility, because that still works too.
Okay, so just 3 things very briefly. 1, do your homework. So you can find a lot of stuff online about different utilities. You can get pretty smart with just like a good Googling. And sometimes I'm a little disappointed that folks haven't done that work before they come in. So just have some basic, do your homework there. Second is listen. So I think there's a lot of emphasis, particularly we're talking at a pitch competition, about what you say. Important. But you also really want to listen to feedback. Try to listen to body language, even things like that, right? So that's 2. And then 3rd is ask questions. And maybe, I should have started with the ask questions first. Again, can often be a transactional exercise in terms of trying to sell or trying to pitch your idea, but you often learn as much, if not more, by asking questions. So that I'd say, do your homework, listen, and ask questions.
So I heard leverage partnerships, show up to events, Google, listen, ask questions. Do we have any extra time for maybe a short audience Q&A? I know that there was a little bit of change in two questions. So we have time for maybe just one question from the audience if there's a question out there, and we don't have a mic, so if you just could kind of yell at us. Oh, we do have a mic. Are there any questions for our panelists?
Josh, I was struck by the use of the term incentives when you started off your conversation, and I think you were commenting on the incentives to your executives or your leaders about how to enable the innovation. And so I think you're with an investor-owned utility, and Jason is with a municipally owned utility. So what does that look like between the two of y'all?
We were speaking at lunch, and I don't think, Jason, you were part of this conversation, that yes, we are an investor-owned utility. The majority of our business is regulated. So around 90% of our business is regulated, and that means what essentially our profits are, what we can invest in. All of that is determined, at least in that part of the regulated business, by our regulator. So maybe we're slightly less of a political enterprise than a muni, but not a whole lot less than that. So what our political leaders want from us really, really matters. And we're going to need to make a case in order to get anything approved by our regulator that it addresses the policy objectives, of our governor, which he's laid out really clearly. We have maybe I would argue, the most ambitious, even more than California, decarbonization plan in the country. And so that's the meta incentive level. The degree to which you can kind of link yourself to the larger picture is really going to help. And then there's a lot of, I won't get into this much detail. There's often incentives at a department level. There's kind of corporate incentives, and some of those are really basic and straightforward, like reliability and safety that probably every utility has. Others are a little bit more difficult to suss out, but sometimes are no less important. But anyway, I'd start with the meta incentives, which are pretty clear, and you can get, frankly, again, from a Google. And then there's a certain set of incentives which are inherent to every utility, and then there's probably going to be a third group, which is maybe a little more idiosyncratic.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's different. They have some advantages that I drool over. Obviously with public funds, we can't make investments in startups and have a rate of return that we could return to our investors. It's just not something that we can do. But we have a little bit less regulation. CPS Energy's regulator is the city of San Antonio. So, that really helps us a lot. Now, there are exceptions to that on the transmission market. We do go to the PUC and have to do things along that end. But being a vertically integrated utility, pretty much small service territory, allows us to do things that we normally wouldn't be able to do if we were an investor-owned and had to get it worked into what you call the rate base, I guess, on that. So we have some flexibility on that, but supporting a brand new startup financially is difficult, if not impossible, for a municipal utility to do, that you can do very easily.
Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Jason. Please join me in thanking our panelists. That is it for us.